Imagine a creature so powerful it could crush planets, tear through time itself, and warp the very fabric of the universe. A being feared across the galaxy, ruling through dominance, intellect, and an unfathomable strength that left civilizations trembling. Yet despite its supremacy, it harbored a fear, one so deep that even the mere thought of it sent a shudder through its monstrous frame. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an opposing force. It wasn't even a cosmic phenomenon beyond its control. It was something much simpler, something that, for centuries, has remained an instinctive behavior among a particular species on Earth: humans. More specifically, the human tendency to sit at the back. But why? What is it about this behavior that unsettled a being of such incomprehensible power? To understand this fear, we must first understand the nature of power itself. Throughout the history of the universe, strength has always dictated hierarchy. The strongest rule, the weak serve. This is a universal constant, an unspoken law that extends beyond the stars, beyond civilizations, and even beyond time itself. And yet humans, these fragile creatures, bound by biological limitations, physically inferior to countless other life forms, possess a trait that sets them apart. They observe, they calculate, and they strategize. Unlike other species that seek dominance through brute force, humans operate differently. They do not always assert power by standing at the front. They do not always challenge openly. Instead, they sit at the back, watching, analyzing, waiting. Throughout history, the back has always been a position of control. In the military, generals do not fight on the front lines. They oversee battles from a vantage point, calculating every move. In politics, the real power is often hidden, operating from behind closed doors. In nature, predators watch from the shadows before striking. The most dangerous individuals are never the ones loudly proclaiming their strength. They are the ones observing in silence, preparing for the perfect moment. Sitting at the back isn't about passivity, it's about control. And that is precisely what made this cosmic entity afraid. It had encountered countless species across the galaxy. Warriors, conquerors, civilizations that fought relentlessly to prove their worth. But humans were different. When confronted with power, they did not always challenge it directly. Instead, they positioned themselves strategically. They adapted, they learned, and most terrifyingly, they understood. This entity had spent eons ruling through fear, crushing any opposition that dared to rise against it. But when it observed humans, it saw something it could not understand. They were not intimidated in the same way. They did not always resist outwardly. Instead, they waited, choosing their moment, never revealing their true intent. Think of any classroom. The ones sitting at the front are often eager, willing to engage directly. But the ones at the back? They are different. They observe more than they speak. They notice details others miss. They understand the dynamics of the room, the power structures at play. And when the time comes, they act with precision. This behavioral pattern is not just a human habit. It is an instinct, an unconscious strategy developed over centuries of survival. And the greatest proof of its power lies in history itself. Every great shift in power has been orchestrated not by those at the forefront, but by those who watched from the back. Revolutions were not sparked by the rulers, but by those who understood the flaws of the system, those who had observed long enough to know exactly when and how to act. The most successful military campaigns were led by strategists who knew that direct confrontation was not always the key to victory. Even in modern warfare, intelligence and information win battles more than brute force. The back is not a place of weakness, it is a place of advantage. This was what terrified the entity. It had encountered warriors before. It had faced countless civilizations that fought recklessly, throwing themselves into battle without a second thought. But humans were different. They played the long game. They sat at the back. They studied. And when they moved, it was with purpose. It realized that their strength did not come from physical might, but from something far more dangerous: understanding. The ability to see patterns, to exploit weaknesses, to predict movements before they happened, to rule through knowledge, rather than strength alone. This fear only deepened when it realized how humans had risen to power on Earth. They were not the strongest species. They did not have the sharpest claws, the thickest armor, or the fastest speed. Yet, they dominated. Why? Because they learned. They adapted to their environment. They outthought their enemies, and they did it all while sitting back, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This cosmic entity, which had ruled through sheer force, could not comprehend this form of power. It had always associated strength with direct action, with dominance, with sheer physical superiority. But humans had shattered this understanding. They had proven that the greatest threat was not always the one standing in front of you, but the one quietly watching from the shadows. The one who appeared unbothered, the one who sat at the back. And so the entity's fear grew, because it knew that true power was not in the hands of the loudest, the strongest, or the most visible. It was held by those who understood when to move and, more importantly, when to wait. Those who did not reveal their intentions until it was far too late. Those who, despite all odds, had conquered their world and were now looking beyond it. Watching, observing, strategizing, sitting at the back, just as they always had. The entity's fear did not stem from ignorance. It had encountered enough civilizations to recognize patterns, to understand the natural progression of power. It had seen empires rise and fall, entire species wiped from existence, and galactic rulers overthrown. Yet there was something about humanity that defied logic. A race so physically unimposing should not have been capable of reaching the stars, let alone surviving against the threats that lurked in the void. And yet, they thrived. Not because of brute strength, but because they had mastered something far more lethal, the art of patience. Patience was not a trait common among conquerors. Most civilizations driven by expansion sought immediate dominance. They waged wars, established colonies, and enforced control through raw power. But humans, they operated differently. They were willing to wait, to observe, to position themselves strategically before making their move. This was evident in every facet of their existence, from their earliest history to their most advanced tactics in warfare. Take, for instance, the ancient hunters of Earth. Unlike the predators of their planet, lions, wolves, or bears, humans did not rely on superior strength to catch their prey. Instead, they used persistence hunting, a technique that involved tracking an animal for hours, even days, exhausting it until it had no choice but to succumb. No other species approached hunting in this manner. Predators struck fast and hard. Humans, however, studied their target, learning its habits, its weaknesses, and then, when the time was right, they claimed their victory. This strategy extended far beyond the hunt. In warfare, humans were among the most formidable tacticians in the galaxy. They had developed an understanding of strategy that few species possessed. It was never about who struck first, but who struck best. The greatest generals in human history were not those who rushed into battle, but those who waited, gathering intelligence, letting their opponents reveal their weaknesses before delivering a decisive blow. The wars of Earth were won not by sheer numbers but by strategic positioning, deception, and patience. Consider the game of chess, one of humanity's most revered intellectual battles. Unlike other competitive games that relied on reflexes or brute force, chess was about foresight. Every move was a calculation, every decision a step toward an inevitable conclusion. The strongest players were not the ones who played aggressively from the start, but those who sat back, allowing their opponent to make mistakes, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. This was how humans thought, not in immediate victories, but in long-term dominance. And this was precisely what unsettled the entity. It had always believed that power was something to be displayed, to be asserted through action and force. But humans had redefined power. To them, the most powerful individual was not the one standing at the front, but the one orchestrating events from behind the scenes, the silent observer, the strategist, the one who sat at the back, unnoticed, until it was too late. It had observed their political structures, their hierarchies, and was disturbed by what it saw. Many of the most influential human leaders throughout history were not those who stood in the limelight, but those who pulled the strings from the shadows. Governments operated with figureheads, while the true power lay in unseen advisors, intelligence agencies, and those who manipulated events without ever revealing their presence. In war, the most dangerous operatives were not the soldiers on the battlefield, but the spies, the codebreakers, the analysts who deciphered enemy movements before a single shot was fired. This was what made humans terrifying. Unlike other species that crave dominance through immediate force, humans had mastered control through subtlety. They had an uncanny ability to remain unnoticed until it was too late. They did not announce their intentions. They did not reveal their strengths. They sat at the back, observed, and when the time was right, they changed everything, and the entity could see it happening again. Humanity had taken its first steps into the cosmos, but unlike other species that announced their presence with grand displays of power, they remained quiet. They explored, they studied, they mapped the galaxy with careful precision. They did not rush to conquer. They did not reveal their full potential. They simply waited. And the entity knew exactly what that meant. It had seen this behavior before, on a planetary scale, within their own history, in their wars, their politics, their games. Every time humans positioned themselves at the back, it was not because they were weak. It was because they were watching, learning, preparing. And if there was one truth that the entity had come to understand, it was this: whenever humans watched, they always found a way to win. The entity now faced a question that had no comforting answer. If humanity, in its infancy as a spacefaring civilization, had already begun to apply these strategies beyond their homeworld, what would they become in 1,000 years? In 10,000? Would they continue to observe, to sit at the back of galactic affairs, unnoticed and unchallenged, until the moment they decided to take control? And when that moment came, would anyone even see it happening before it was too late? Because that was the essence of human power. The ability to exist unnoticed. To let others believe they were insignificant. To let their enemies assume they posed no threat. Until, one day, when the stars had grown too comfortable and the rulers of the galaxy had become too complacent, humanity would stand, not from the front, but from the shadows. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, they would already be in control. The entity shuddered. It had seen its own end, and it had come in the form of creatures who, time and time again, had chosen to sit at the back. The entity's fear had now crystallized into something undeniable. It was not a fleeting concern, not a momentary doubt. It was a deep, visceral realization. The kind of realization that gnawed at the mind like a whisper in the dark, a creeping inevitability that could not be escaped. Humanity was different, and it was not their strength, their technology, or even their intelligence that set them apart. It was their ability to wait, to blend in, to appear insignificant until the moment they chose to strike. As it watched them move through the stars, expanding their knowledge rather than their territory, it saw a pattern it had encountered before. Empires that did not seek immediate conquest, but instead gathered power in silence, always proved to be the deadliest. The entity had seen civilizations wiped out not by the strongest warriors, but by those who had mastered patience, those who understood that time itself could be a weapon, and humanity understood this better than any species it had ever encountered. The history of their world was a testament to this truth. While other species relied on their natural advantages, claws, fangs, sheer size, humans had none of these. Yet they had conquered their planet, not because they were the fastest, the strongest, or the fiercest, but because they had learned how to wait, how to outlast their enemies, how to play the long game. The greatest transformations in their history had come from those who had chosen to move in the shadows, to manipulate events without drawing attention to themselves. This was evident in every revolution, every uprising, every shift in power. The people who changed history were rarely the ones shouting in the streets. They were the ones who had spent years, decades, even generations planting the seeds of change, waiting for the moment when they could step forward and claim what had always been theirs. And the entity knew that humanity, now stretching its reach into the cosmos, was doing the same thing on a much larger scale. Other species, upon achieving interstellar travel, had rushed to proclaim their dominance. They had sought war, territory, control. Humanity, however, had done something different. They had chosen to watch, to learn, to map the political landscape of the galaxy without revealing their own ambitions. They had positioned themselves exactly as they always had, at the back, unseen, unassuming. But the entity understood what that meant. It meant that humanity was not simply wandering the stars in search of knowledge. They were watching. They were identifying weaknesses, calculating risks, gathering every piece of information they needed before making their move. They had studied the mistakes of those who had come before them, the empires that had burned too brightly and collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. Humanity would not make the same mistakes. They would wait, unnoticed, until the moment was right. And then, when the galaxy had grown comfortable, when its rulers had stopped seeing them as a threat, humanity would act, and they would win, because that was the pattern. The undeniable truth that had been proven time and time again. The ones who sat at the back, the ones who observed in silence, the ones who played the long game, always emerged victorious in the end. The entity had thought itself invincible. It had ruled through fear, through overwhelming power. But now, it saw the flaw in its approach. Power that was flaunted could be challenged. Strength that was shown could be tested. But power that remained hidden? That was unstoppable. And that was the power humanity had perfected. A terrifying thought crept into its mind. Had humanity already begun? Had they already placed themselves within the foundations of galactic society, unnoticed, preparing for the moment when they would rise? Were they already influencing events in ways no one had yet realized? Were they, right now, watching? And then came the final, most chilling realization of all. If they were, no one would know. Not until it was too late. Because that was the way of humanity. That was their nature. They did not conquer through brute force. They did not announce their intentions. They did not stand at the front. They sat at the back, and they waited. The entity had always believed it understood power. It had witnessed entire civilizations rise and fall, seen species claw their way to dominance only to be crushed, under the weight of their own ambition. Power, as it had always known it, was about presence. It was about imposing one's will upon the universe, about standing at the forefront and making existence bow in submission. But then came humanity. And humanity did something no species had ever done before. They did nothing. At least, that's what it looked like on the surface. For years, centuries even, they had expanded without expanding, settled without conquering, observed without interfering. They were a species that should have been insignificant, a race that should have faded into the endless backdrop of the cosmos like so many others before them. But they hadn't. They had stayed quiet, hidden, watching. The entity had seen this before, this pattern of silence that always preceded a shift in power. The most dangerous forces were never the ones who announced themselves. They were the ones who seemed unassuming, who blended in, who let others believe they were weak, until one day, they weren't. And now, something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But to an ancient mind that had ruled for eons, the shift was undeniable. The quiet hum of the galaxy had taken on a different rhythm, a new pattern that did not belong. Humanity had begun to move. Not in the way other species did, with fleets or armies or grand declarations. No, their movement was quieter, like the slow closing of a snare around an unsuspecting target. A few key political shifts in galactic governments, a minor economic collapse on a fringe world that, curiously, benefited human trade routes. A new technological advancement that came not from humanity itself, but from an allied species that had just recently entered into deeper cooperation with them. Coincidence? No, not to the entity. It recognized the signs. Humanity was no longer just watching. They were setting the stage. The most unsettling part was how little resistance they faced. Because there was nothing to resist. No armies, no invasions, no declarations of intent. Just a series of small, unnoticeable events that, on their own, meant nothing. But together, they painted a picture of a slow, methodical ascension that no one seemed to realize was happening. No one except the entity. And it was already too late to stop them. The entity's unease grew. It had lived long enough to recognize a slow conquest when it saw one. Wars did not always begin with weapons. Sometimes they began with whispers, with influence, with careful positioning of pieces on a board so vast that the game was won before the opponent even knew they were playing. Humanity was playing such a game, and the entity realized something even more terrifying. They had been playing it for far longer than anyone had noticed. It reviewed the records. It analyzed the movements. It traced humanity's presence in galactic affairs back to the beginning of their expansion. At first, it had been like any other fledgling species, eager, exploratory, seemingly naive in its approach to interstellar politics. They had joined trade networks, formed diplomatic alliances, shared knowledge, even taken part in minor military conflicts, always aligning themselves with those who appeared stronger. But the deeper the entity looked, the more it saw the true pattern emerge. Humanity had never been aimless. Every alliance, every trade deal, every act of war had served a greater purpose. They had woven themselves into the fabric of the galaxy so seamlessly that no one had questioned it. And now, they were everywhere. Not in control, not officially, but their influence had spread in ways that could no longer be ignored. A species that was still considered young had somehow gained the ability to sway entire sectors without ever claiming dominion over them. They did not rule through force. They ruled through ideas, through economic dependencies, through quiet shifts in policy that always seemed to benefit them in the long run. And the entity saw something else, something far more dangerous. They were patient, unbelievably patient. They did not take power the way others did, with bold conquests or immediate takeovers. They let power come to them. They let other species invite them in, let them become necessary. The galaxy had not realized it yet, but it had already been shaped by human hands, and the entity knew exactly what that meant. When the time came, when humanity finally decided to rise from the shadows, there would be no war, no dramatic battles, no desperate struggles for control. Because humanity would already own everything that mattered, and no one would even realize it had happened. The entity no longer saw humanity as a mere anomaly. It saw them as an inevitability. The pieces were already in place. The network of influence they had built stretched across the galaxy like an invisible web, threading through governments, economies, and even cultures. And yet, no one had seen it happen. That was humanity's greatest strength. Not power in the conventional sense, but the ability to become indispensable without appearing dominant. The entity scoured the records again, looking for a flaw in their design, a weakness it could exploit. But the more it searched, the more it understood just how deep humanity's influence had spread. It was not just in politics or trade, it was in thought itself. It saw it in the way other species had begun to adopt human philosophies, their strategic patience infecting even the warlike civilizations that had once prided themselves on brute strength. The most aggressive empires in the galaxy, once ruled by conquest and immediate displays of power, had begun to change. Their military leaders spoke of long-term positioning and calculated restraint, phrases that had no place in their history, until they encountered humanity. It was more than influence. It was infiltration on a conceptual level. The entity searched deeper. Were there key figures responsible for this shift? Were there human leaders orchestrating it all from the shadows? But no, that was the terrifying part. There was no central authority directing this slow conquest. It was organic. It was simply the way humanity operated. Their tendency to wait, to observe, to maneuver from unseen angles. It was not a conscious strategy, but an inherent trait. And that meant stopping them was impossible. There was no single leader to assassinate, no one organization to dismantle, no secret council pulling the strings. Humanity did not need one. Every human, in their own way, was part of this grand strategy without even realizing it. They were patient by nature, adaptable by necessity, and when placed in a galactic arena filled with species that relied on predictability, they became the ultimate disruptors. The entity saw it happening even now. Galactic leaders sought human advisors for counsel, trusting their unique perspectives. Alien corporations invested in human markets, unknowingly tying their economies to them. Military strategists studied human warfare, not realizing they were reshaping their own doctrines to match those of a species that had never lost a war it truly committed to. It was already too late. Humanity did not need to declare war to win. They had already won, and no one had noticed. The realization sat heavy within the entity. a weight more suffocating than the crushing depths of a dying star. The galaxy had always assumed that power lay in fleets, in armies, in the ability to seize, control through force. But humanity had rewritten the rules. No, they had never played by them in the first place. And now, they had become something far more dangerous than conquerors. They had become necessary. The entity watched as alien civilizations unknowingly reinforced their own dependence on humanity. Galactic infrastructure now ran on human-designed systems, their algorithms optimizing trade, logistics, and even resource distribution across thousands of worlds. The interstellar banking system, once fragmented and chaotic, had adopted human principles of stability and long-term investment, linking entire economies to their slow and steady influence. Even culture had been affected. It was subtle at first. A human song played in the background of a diplomatic gathering, a phrase from an old Earth philosopher woven into the speech of a non-human ruler. A shift in the way alien species viewed time itself, not as something to be dominated, but something to be leveraged. It was everywhere. But no one feared them, not openly. That was the brilliance of it. Humanity never demanded submission. They never conquered through violence. They simply became woven into the very fabric of the galaxy, until removing them was no longer an option. The entity had seen species fall before. Empires had risen and collapsed, leaving only ruins and cautionary tales in their wake. But what humanity had done, what they were still doing, was different. They were not building an empire. They were becoming the foundation upon which the galaxy stood, and when the moment came, when the right pieces fell into place, and humanity finally chose to step forward, no one would even think to resist. Because by then, the galaxy would already belong to them. The entity had always believed itself to be beyond fear. It had lived through ages, watched civilizations rise and fall, orchestrated its own dominance with ruthless precision. But now, as it pieced together the final threads of humanity's quiet ascent, it felt something it had not experienced in millennia. Dread. Humanity had done the impossible. They had taken control of the galaxy without ever announcing their intentions, without ever lifting a single war banner. They had not fought for the throne. They had become the architects of the palace itself. Every system, every alliance, every foundation of interstellar civilization now had human fingerprints upon it. The entity tried to calculate a way to stop them. Could they be removed? Could their influence be undone? But no, any attempt to sever humanity from the galaxy would be like trying to remove the roots of a tree without collapsing the entire forest. They were too deeply embedded, too interwoven into the mechanics of galactic existence. And then came the final realization, the one that sent a chill through the entity's ancient mind. Humanity had not even revealed their endgame yet. They had not made demands. They had not declared themselves rulers. They had simply positioned themselves perfectly, waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, when they finally decided to step out of the shadows and claim what had always been theirs, there would be no resistance. Because by then, every species in the galaxy would already see them as necessary, as inevitable. And so the entity did the only thing it could do. It remained silent. It watched. It waited, just as humanity had always done. Because if there was one thing the entity had learned, it was this. The ones who sat at the back always saw everything. And when they finally chose to stand, the galaxy would never be the same. The entity sat in its chamber, watching the Galactic Council convene. A gathering of the most powerful species, the architects of empires, the leaders of entire star clusters. It had seen meetings like this before, where decisions were made, wars were declared, futures were rewritten. But today was different. Today, for the first time, humanity sat at the center of the discussion. Not by force, not by conquest, but because every species present had, in one way or another, come to rely on them. Some sought human wisdom, others their technology. Some merely wanted to understand how a species so young had managed to surpass those who had ruled the stars for millennia, and humanity, as always, remained quiet, listening, observing, waiting. The entity understood now. The galaxy had not been conquered, it had been prepared. For what? It still did not know. But whatever was coming, humanity would be ready. And when the time was right, they would stand, and the galaxy would follow. The chamber was vast, a construct of impossible scale and elegance, hovering in the void between civilizations. It was older than most of the species gathered within it, a testament to the cycles of power that had come and gone across the stars. Here, decisions that shaped entire eras were made. Rulers had risen and fallen under the weight of words spoken, in this very hall. And today, humanity was here. The entity watched from its position in the council, its form draped in the shimmering insignia of its kind. It did not speak, nor did it need to. Its influence had been cemented long ago, an unshakable force in galactic politics. But even now, even with the weight of its own civilization behind it, it felt something it had not in eons: unease. Across the chamber, the representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species debated, their voices weaving through layers of translation and transmission. The subject at hand was, officially, trade agreements and economic restructuring, following the collapse of a minor empire on the outer fringes. But everyone in the room understood the true purpose of this gathering. It was humanity. They had not declared war. They had not overthrown governments. They had not even asked for power. And yet, they were here, positioned not at the back as they once had been, but at the very heart of the discussion. Not by force, but because every species present had, in some way, come to rely on them. The Ralthuri, once conquerors of entire sectors, now consulted human advisors for guidance and economic stability. The Zith, whose warrior clans had dominated battlefields, for centuries had quietly begun restructuring their military doctrines based on human tactics. Even the enigmatic Kithal, beings who prided themselves on their foresight, had failed to predict this moment, the moment humanity became essential. A human representative sat at the central table, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. He had not spoken much, yet when he did, the chamber quieted. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. The entity knew this man was not the leader of humanity. He was merely one of many, a single figure in a species that had, somehow, positioned itself at the crossroads of every major power in the galaxy. And that was the true brilliance of it all. Humanity did not rule through domination. They ruled through reliance, through patience, through the slow, deliberate construction of a web that now bound the galaxy together. If humanity were to vanish tomorrow, the entire interstellar order would collapse under its own weight. They had done what no empire had ever accomplished. They had made themselves indispensable. The entity observed the gathered leaders, studying their reactions. Some still clung to the illusion of control, speaking in dismissive tones as if humanity's presence was a mere anomaly. Others had already accepted reality, shifting their positions to align with the rising power before them. But there were those, like the entity itself, who understood the full scope of what had happened. This was not the beginning of humanity's rise. That had happened long ago, in the shadows, in the moments no one had noticed. This was the moment the galaxy finally realized it. And yet, the most terrifying truth had not yet been spoken. Humanity had still not revealed what they wanted. They had positioned themselves at the heart of everything, but they had not made demands. They had not claimed territories or declared sovereignty over lesser species. They had simply become necessary, and that was what made them truly dangerous. Because the moment they did decide to take the next step, when they finally chose to stand at the forefront instead of the back, there would be no war, no rebellion, no struggle. Because by then, every species in the galaxy would already see them not as rulers, but as the very foundation of existence itself. The entity lowered its gaze, silent in its realization. The galaxy had not been conquered, it had been prepared. And when the time came, humanity would not need to take power. The galaxy would give it to them. Please subscribe this channel for more interesting stories like this. Thanks.